Houston. Okay. So
Hello.
I'm a nerd.
Welcome to the show.
Yeah, welcome to the show. There's quibbles over coffee. I'm a nerd. This is a known
Okay.
this is a known fact. I'm a nerd. Because I'm a nerd, I go to a nerd school, and at my nerd school, I take nerd classes. One of my nerd
Yeah.
classes at my nerd school is about space, specifically about militarization of space, and the sort of the future of warfare from a space perspective, from international conflict perspective. This is part of my minor, which is in cybersecurity and international conflict. Okay,
Okay.
so in this
So like
class,
space national security?
space national security. It's quite an interesting class. I really like my professor. He's a great dude. In this class, we're discussing astropolitique, which is a framework for geopolitics, which is written by Everett Dolman. And Dolman is a friend slash one time coworker of my professor. My professor is a realist, so is Dolman. But my professor is a realist in that he thinks that's the way the world works. Dolman is a realist in that he thinks that's the way the world should work. So realism basically just means, for context, this is true both for the context of space, but also just sort of worldwide. Realism just means basically might makes right. The dude with the biggest stick gets to make everyone do what he says, because that's how sticks work, right? Essentially. That's
Yeah.
basically what realism is. There's also liberalism. Liberalism basically means that the way that the world works is that people work together, and if you get the people to work together in a way that is beneficial to you, then whoopee. Basically, it's all about international trade, all of that shit. Then you have Marxism. Marxism is has a lot to do with control over labor. I have a different form. My form is a Georgist approach to foreign policy. So my framework is much more about who has control, yes, over labor, but also over natural resources, right? So I think that the people who are in control are the people who control natural resources and the ability to control labor. So if you're a feudalist, that means you control all of the natural resources. That means that you have full control. If you're a slave owner, that means you control all of the work, the labor, which means that you have full control. Either one of those, I think, is equally immoral, equally a problem. Okay. Astropolitique is this framework for space development, which basically suggests that like whoever gets there first should just control everything. And specifically, therefore, America should get there first. That's basically their framework. I think it's dumb.
Okay.
I think it's dumb. I want to make an argument to the contrary. Is make a framework of how space should function, and I need your help.
So is this like the space island like we did before with like the landlord thing?
This is the landlord thing, but
So
I
it's
want
kind
to
of like
figure
what
out
it seems like
exactly.
it's like
That's
on a
where it's
larger
coming down
scale.
to. It's on a larger scale. So for context on the
Yeah.
land thing that both of us are discussing, there's a previous
You
episode.
should watch that other
You
episode.
should watch that other episode. It's about land. And basically my framework is that I think
Yeah.
that all of the land should be I'm a little bit uncomfortable saying owned by the government, because I don't think that air is owned by the government, but like practically speaking, the way that we build our laws is that air is is owned by the government, because when someone sues you for polluting the air, it's the government, right? When you're polluting the water, it's the government who responds to that. When you do things, so like I guess in a sort of hazy way, yeah, I do kind of want the government to be the one who owns it, but I want it all to be rented out immediately. So I want the land to be rented. I shouldn't say all of it. There should still be parks, but the parts that are currently privately owned should continue to be privately used, but they should be rented out from the government. They should be rented out in two different directions. One of them would be historic rent, as you imagine it currently. The other one would be infrastructural rent. So infrastructural rent would be to say that instead of paying money to the government, you build up infrastructure of equivalent value. And so if you're building an $100,000 piece of infrastructure house on a plot, that would mean that you get access to that plot for an amount of time approximately equivalent to $100,000 of rent, right? And then after that, from that point forward, the United States government would be able to rent it out for a higher amount of money, because you have increased the value of that plot by putting on this infrastructure, right? So that's like the basic framework. That is relatively comprehensible in the United States, because we understand what it is to be part of the United States. We understand what the government is. We understand who is supposed to be in control and what organization would be the one responsible for such a land bank, right? Okay. perfectly reasonable. Space genuinely doesn't have an owner yet, not in the sense that air doesn't have an owner yet, but in the sense that like no one has become conscious enough of space to think about ownership of space yet, because it doesn't have fiscal value. Air obviously does, right? We obviously recognize I want a carbon dividend. Not everyone wants a carbon dividend, but virtually all economists do want a carbon dividend, and part of the reason for that is because we recognize there's a fiscal value to air, and we all need to have equal access to air, literally, in order to survive, right? Okay. I think that space. So I said this to my professor, and his immediate response was like, "Okay." So basically, my statement to my professor after class, I believe it was on Wednesday, whatever it was. We were talking after class, and I said, "Hey, this is what I want to do." We were talking about astropolitik, and I was like, "This shit is fucking bullshit." And he said, "Yeah, man, but like, what you gonna do? Like, it is true. Like whoever gets there first is going to control the space." And I'm like, "Yeah, man, but I don't like it." And he's like, "Yeah, I don't give a shit if you like it. It's just how it works, Jonah. You got to deal with it." I was like, but like, you know? And so my framework was like, okay, I'm a Georgist, right? I'm going to take a Georgist perspective on this. I'm going to take this lens. I'm going to say, okay, all of this should be rented out in the same way that I'm framing in the context of land. You should rent out access to the moon. So whoever gets the highest bidder is the one who gets this given plot of the moon. There'd be a question of like how we're going to divvy everything up. Of course, there always is. But like once we figure out how we're going to divvy up the different given plots, then you rent out to the highest bidder of all the given plots. Seems reasonable enough, right? But the question is, where does that money go? Who gets that money? Right now, there's not that much money. So it doesn't really matter. It can be to the UN. It could be to fucking me. It doesn't matter. Because basically, there's enough space on the moon, right? There's enough space in the air. There's enough space in space that like, it just doesn't matter yet. And so basically the amount that would be paid on rent is negligible. The amount of like the cost is actually about getting there rather than the cost of like paying whoever it is who has ownership over that thing. That's where we are currently, but it's not gonna be true forever. That's only true for now. And one of the really scary things that astropolitik goes into is it talks about this idea of, and I don't want to sort of show the book itself because obviously I don't want to get copyrighted, but we're looking at this response to it or whatever it is. But like one of the really interesting things about it is that it talks a little bit about the idea of this sort of stopgap, right? This problem of like, how do we get up into space? Right? That's like a really, like once you're up in space, basically you can go wherever the fuck you want. And like, it's not that much more expensive to get from point A to point B than it is like once you're already up there. The cost is largely about getting up there. In the same way that we think about the canal, the Suez Canal, which was, you know, the reason I'm bringing it up is of course, because it was blocked, right? That was blocked accidentally, right? There was an idiot who crashed into the side. And the result of that is that we had 15% of trade, international trade, goes through that canal, right? 15%. And so literally hundreds of billions of dollars were, you know, just sort of shit out of luck, right? Forced to stay. And I think it's really important to think about canals and think about these stopgaps, these sort of these cut points of like, how do we get past these cut points that are really, really valuable and important for trade. Right now, access to space is not that important because there's just not that much going on up there yet. But eventually it will be extremely important. And someone's going to make the first space elevator, right? Someone's going to make, whoever has the most efficient way of getting off of Earth has a huge advantage in the same way that whoever has the fastest way of getting around Africa / through Africa through the Suez Canal, or you know, around South America / through the Panama Canal, or in the case of China, they're trying to create one in Nicaragua because they don't want to go through the Panama Canal because they don't want to have to be reliant on the U.S. who controls the Panama Canal, right? Like all of these are really important frameworks for trade, and his argument, Dolman's argument in Astropolitik, is essentially that the United States has an obligation to control that canal, has an obligation to control the choke point of getting up into space. And fuck you, right? My reaction is fuck you. Now, my reaction is fuck you from like a, not particularly from an American perspective, but from like an international development perspective, because it's in the interest of Earth if shit gets through the Suez Canal, regardless of who owns the Suez Canal. It's in the interest of Earth that shit gets through Panama. It's in the interest of Earth that shit gets up into space and down from space so that we can continue to trade, right? Or in the interest of humanity writ large, because presumably we're talking about an interplanetary society, right? So like, it's dangerous that that's a framework, but I don't think he's crazy to recognize it as a future framework that is going to be a thing. But I don't want it to be a thing. So how do we fix it, Houston?
I don't know. Because I mean, it's the same thing as like the canals. Like whoever creates it is the one who's going to be controlling it, and no like private citizen is going to be able to create it without the help of the government. So,
right, yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, whoever unless you become president when this happens.
I have no interest in being president. That sounds like an awful job.
Yeah.
It's such a bad job. Well, I would love to be
maybe,
Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, but I would never want to be president. Yeah.
Maybe like if a Georges becomes president.
If a Georges becomes president.
Happens,
yeah. So okay.
And they decide to rent out the space elevator.
Right, but so here's the question, like, because there's sort of two questions, right? Because the reason that I believe in this rental system for land in the context of the United States is because I think that doing that means that we don't have to tax people as much because all of this rent is a stand-in for taxation, right? And that makes us much more efficient, right? Because now we have we have a giant way to bring in literally trillions of dollars into the U.S. Government without having to worry about like how are we taxing people, any of that shit. But it's more than that. It's also about like that we're in a better position, right? The Henry George theorem that Joseph Stiglitz has worked a lot on suggests that we're able to be more efficient if we're able to be building up public infrastructure and private infrastructure because it suggests that in many cases you're actually able to increase the value of the surrounding land or the surrounding infrastructure or the surrounding sort of plots. I shouldn't say land here because I do include infrastructure here. I include property beyond just the land itself. But you're increasing that value by more than the cost of the infrastructure when you build a lot of different kinds of infrastructure. So specifically when you talk about subways, almost universally this is true. When you're talking about building up more housing, when you're building schools, neighborhoods, all of that, it's broadly better for all of the surrounding infrastructure when you do that. It increases its value by more than the value of the infrastructure that you're building. So like in that sense, I think that you're a more efficient economy if you're doing the way that I'm framing in that context. But it's more than that also in the context of like the carbon dividend. I argue for it, yes, because I think it's morally correct that we own the air and that we should get paid when people are polluting the air. But I also think it's the best way, and I'm not the only one who thinks this is true, of a huge number, I think it's 12 different people who have won the Nobel Prize in economics, an additional like 3,000 some odd people who are economists working at a professorial level. All of these different people believe that this is the best solution to climate change. And so like that's a part of it. But there's also a question of like how is that money going to be spent, right? And who gets to be the one who spends it? And in the context of like the carbon dividend, it is pretty reasonable. You say that the individual country should be the one who's going to be the one taxing this. In the context of a land bank, it's pretty reasonable. You say these are the individual people who should be the ones who are accruing the rent because they're the land because this is their country, right? All of that seems valid. It's a lot more complicated in space. It's a lot more complicated when we're talking about international waters. It's a lot more complicated when we're talking about places that fundamentally don't belong to an individual country. And I'd argue fundamentally can't belong to an individual country. My answer, and this is going to get a little bit woo-woo and a little bit like progressive leftist, whatever the fuck. I think we need to have this be owned by the UN. I think that if we're going to make a space elevator, it has to be owned by the UN.
But not every country is involved in the UN, though, is it?
That's technically true, but all of the important ones are. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like that, like you're right.
Yeah.
You're right, but also, like that's the equivalent of saying that not every American can vote. right? So like when you say that like American citizens should be able to be the ones deciding how to use the land in the context of the United States, like you are right that there are people who live in America who aren't citizens. You are right that there are people who are citizens, and because of previous incarceration and awful laws around incarceration, they're not allowed to vote, right?
Yeah.
That is valid.
Would have been like territories.
Yeah, or the territories. Guam, yeah, obviously, people in Guam and Puerto Rico and the USVI should obviously be able to vote in the electoral college. But I think that broadly saying that America, belongs to its citizenry, while wrong, if you're really going to unpack it to its fullest degree, is a reasonable starting point, given the way that our international system is built up. So similarly, if we're talking about like. You seem not to buy it. You seem not to buy it. What would you?
I mean, like it. I mean, it is like it does. But does it belong to its citizenry? Like, kind of. I think it belongs to like a select group of people that run it. That might be changing now, but I think generally, historically anyway, it hasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So historically, okay, let's reframe that. Maybe it doesn't belong to its citizenry; it belongs to its voters. If you don't vote, if you can't vote, and if you don't vote, I don't think that you're actually. Maybe you are still a voter, but you're not a voting member.
Yeah.
Like your shares aren't voting shares.
Yeah.
You're a silent partner. You know what I'm saying? Something like that. But you're still part of America.
The UN. So yeah, you're saying those smaller countries who aren't a part of it don't get a say.
Yeah, and if you're arguing that they should get a say, I would agree with you. And if you're arguing that like the way that the UN is set up to, both number one have a Security Council that allows a certain number of countries to override the decisions of all the rest of the countries. I think that's valid. I also think it's valid to criticize the UN because we pretend that all countries, when we're not talking about the Security Council, are worthy of equal votes, even though they don't have the equal number of citizens. I think that's reasonable. I think there are a lot of different criticisms that we can levy at the UN, but I do think that the UN is the closest that we have to an international system. To an international organization that could be responsible in their relationship to a space elevator or to and I'm not just limiting this to space elevator. I think that this is probably the direction we should be going in the Suez Canal. I think it's the direction, like right now, practically speaking, Egypt controls the Suez Canal. They don't. The United States controls the Suez Canal. The United States controls the Panama Canal, right? When there's a thing in Nicaragua, it's going to be controlled by the Chinese, right? Like there's a real there's a reality that like when we talk about the Suez Canal, like yes, American warships do have to pay to go through. That part's true, but they also get to cut the line, and other countries don't get to cut the line. Only Americans get to cut the line in the Suez Canal, right? I believe the same is true of the Panama Canal. I'm not entirely sure about that. I know it's true of the Suez Canal. But like, this is a real, it is true that there are advantages to controlling the Suez Canal. There are advantages to controlling Panama. And if there ever were war, it would be a huge advantage to control those. But I think that it's probably not good for international security. And it's probably not good for international relationships. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first thing.
Yeah.
The UN has to control the space elevator. That's the first part of. We're not going to call it astropolitique. We're going to call it Jonah politique. George's politique. We're going to call it George's politique because then it sounds less self-centered. Actually, no. We're going to call it Lizzie Maggie. We're going to call it Lizzie Maggie politique because I don't think she gets nearly enough credit. Lizzie Maggie is the greatest woman of all time. I have a huge crush on Lizzie Maggie, which is unfortunate because she's been dead for a while. But. Okay. Okay, so Lizzie Mallet.
Maggie Teague.
So Maggie Teague, yes, Maggie Teague. Maggie Teague, with respect to space travel, is to start with that we have to have the space elevator controlled by the UN. I also think that we have to have the Mars and Moon controlled by the UN as well. I think that when you get there, you have to pay rent to the UN. Now, there is a question of how that money should be used. And I don't think that the answer is to say the UN just gets to keep it and do whatever the fuck they want with it. I think there are two possible answers. Answer number one is we just give it as a dividend to every single human, like all of the humans on Earth. Very difficult to do, particularly in places like North Korea, because the Korean government fucking sucks. We do not stand North Korea on this podcast. So like that part is going to be very difficult. That's a possible solution that I think is reasonable. The other solution is to say that all of this money will be set aside exclusively for space development.
I'd say that's reasonable.
So I think it's reasonable too, but there's a couple of reasonable criticisms of it. The first criticism of it is it suggests, so realistically, who's going to get to space first? America, maybe China, Russia. These are the countries that are going to get there first, right? Israel.
Yeah.
Those are the countries. Iran, maybe. Like those are the countries that are going to matter in space development, as well as the EU to a lesser extent. We don't really care about the EU. They're basically just our toy. You know, they're like Canada's our top hat. You know, Europe is sort of our purse, if you will. Yeah. We have they're whatever they are. They're like off-brand. They're the store-bought version of the United States. That's what they are. They're also older, and they technically came first. This is what they are. You know how there's Oreos, and there's also those like whatchamacalls that aren't Oreos that came first? I forget what they're called.
Yeah.
But like whatever those are, that's
Ox something.
Ox something, whatever the fuck it is. Yeah, let's look it up.
Yeah, because it's just
this is important for
there
the
was just a
context of the
theory.
story. There's an Ox something.
There's just a food theory on it.
Yeah. Was there
It's
really?
like oxygen.
Oreos
Yeah, there's a food theory.
versus
Matt Pett did a food theory on
Hydrox.
them.
That's what they're called. Hydrox. Yes.
Hydrox,
Europe
yeah.
is the Hydrox to the United States is the Oreo. That's what. Okay.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah, I mean, they really were like, hey, we're not going to be imperialist anymore. And the United States said,
We will. Yeah.
Yeah.
We will. We're done being an imperialist. No, you're not done. You lost. That's why. No, don't pretend that you did this because of some like moral change in the way that you think about the world. No, you still would like to be imperialist. You're just not because you're losers. That's what you are. You lost. You're a loser. Europe, you lose. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know
They
how
lost
the
a
fuck
lot,
we went to
too.
that. The point is, back to
Anyway.
space travel, which is very
Okay.
important. We have to be talking about right now, right? Because otherwise,
yes.
like, what the fuck?
Of course.
You know, like it's very important that this
Yeah,
be
what else
discussed
are we talking
now.
about?
You know. Anyway, so with respect to space travel, I think that. If we're spending this money and just giving it back as a dividend to everyone, that doesn't really work because it's very difficult to do that because of the way that our country system is set up. And I also don't think that America would necessarily get on board with that. And other countries, mostly America, but other countries as well, that are very invested in space travel comparative to others. It's not in our interest. So I think all of the money would go to the UN, but the UN would be responsible explicitly and exclusively to use it on development of access to space. That's my framework. All of the money. Now, in the short term, that makes a lot of sense. When we're only talking about billions of dollars, that makes sense. But eventually, we're going to be talking about trillions of dollars. We're going to be talking about a lot of fucking money going up, right? Because eventually, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to go to like the other ones that aren't Mars, mostly Mars, but we're going to go to the other ones that aren't Mars also. And like, you know, that's going to really fundamentally change our international system, particularly because we're going to be doing a lot of mining up there of the asteroid belt. Because there's a lot of interesting materials up there that I would love to get my hands on. But like, why are you laughing? Those are wonderful materials. We stand the materials in the asteroid belt, Houston, okay? We absolutely stand
all that
them.
vibranium.
All of that vibranium. Oh my God, orgasmic vibranium. Yes. We support the vibranium. Okay. Yes. And also the cobalt. We also support the cobalt. Okay. So the point is that we're going to take all of that shit and we're going to be bringing it back whoosh, to Earth, right? So there's two questions. Number one, when you take something out, right? So the framework for land and the framework for air is pretty simple because basically, right, that's a natural resource. It's a permanent natural resource. It's not going away anytime soon. By using land, you're not giving up the existence of the land. By using by using ores, right? By using oil or by using any number of those things, you are using them up, right? And that is different. So the historic framework from a Georgist perspective has always been to say, okay, you can rent the access to be the one who gets to mine, right? But it is worth unpacking that the mining rights today are worth a hell of a lot more than the mining rights will be worth in 200 years if we mine it all up, right?
Yeah.
So that's worth unpacking, and it's worth recognizing the fact that some countries are going to be the first ones to get there, and other countries are not going to be the first countries to get there. And I think ultimately this sounds awful, but I'm a little bit on Team Dolman that if you get there first, you get there first. And now I think that the money should be.
Wow.
Well, I mean, like, what's the alternative?
No, I just was trying to point you out on your going back on what you said.
No, I think he's a fuckhead.
I think
I think he's a fuckhead. Don't get me wrong. I do not appreciate Dolman, but like that doesn't mean that he's wrong universally. You know, like I don't know what's the alternative, right? Like if it's not whoever gets there first gets to mine it. Number one, what's the reason that people should try to get there? Because the only reason you'd go there is to try to mine. And number two, like, I don't know. There's a lot of sort of complexity there, but I think it's pretty reasonable to say that while the rent should go to, this international organization, that the mining rights itself should go to the person who gets there first. Yeah. So that's my framework there.
Yeah.
I think this is a reasonable framework. I think that I've laid out my argument, and I think that this 26-minute video is superior to his 224-page book on the subject matter. And I recognize that neither of us have a PhD in this issue, but I think I've answered space travel.
You should send it to him and see what he says.
You think? That's quite interesting.
Yeah, send it to your professor.
I'm
and
not
ask
going
your
to send
professor.
this to my professor.
Why not?
I like my professor. I don't want him to judge me too intensely. Also, we cursed a lot on this professor. I don't think I insulted him. I do like my professor, but yeah. Okay. Any other last thoughts before we end this one? Actually, no. We have to end this one by looking at Hydrox and recognizing that Europe is inferior. We have to give a moment to recognize the inferiority of
Europe.
Images of Hydrox.
Yeah.
Look at this. It's not even loading. You know why? Look at this. Look at that right there. Look at that. Look at it. Look at it. Look at it. Look at it. You know what that is? That is inferiority. That's what happens when your empire collapses. That is probably made in the US.
Yeah.
We're going to get that off the screen. Okay. Hydrox, inferior. European, gross. Buy Oreos. Oreos are good. Like and subscribe. No artificial flavors or colors.